Welcome everybody. I'm going to read chapter 13, Kings and Prophets. The end of the reign of Solomon, about 930 BC, sounded the death knell of Israel's attempt to become a competitor in the game of power politics. This was not the role that had been cast for the descendants of Abraham, the friend of God. Unless the whole Bible is nonsense from beginning to end, we have to recognise that God chose to disclose the meaning and purpose of human life through the unlikely channel of one particular racial group, the Jews. But perhaps the whole process makes sense when we learn to accept the fact that what is nonsense to us in our human pride is indeed the way that God works. There's nothing more nonsensical, humanly speaking, than that God should have selected Israel to be the means of communicating the truth about life. Unless it is that he should have chosen a Galilean carpenter to be the fullest expression of what we can understand about him, or that the record of his dealings with mankind should be committed to such an apparently haphazard composition as the Bible. No doubt, this is why St. Paul, who was far more farsighted than most of us, said that God's foolishness is wiser than the wisdom of men. If all this makes human nonsense but divine sense, we shall recognise in the story of Israel the story of mankind seen through the wrong end of the telescope. So that on that tiny stage of the Levant, there was enacted a veritable divine comedy, in which all the issues that affect the world for good or for ill were presented for our edification. In the failure of her kings, Israel was being taught, as we are being taught through her, that the people whom God had chosen could not fulfill their role in the world by aping the standards and the values of other nations. It was not by the might of armies, or by territorial expansion, or by economic progress that Israel would accomplish her mission of bringing the world to the knowledge of the truth about God and the purpose of man's existence. Whatever virtues Saul, David, and Solomon may have had, and they had many, they were not the kind of men to lead the people of God along the way to their appointed destiny. Nationalistic and imperialistic dreams had to be shattered before Israel found her true vocation. Not because these things were bad in themselves, but because the kind of kingdom that the people of God had to build would come not by might and not by power, but by the Spirit of God. So Israel had to experience the disintegration of her little empire. The chroniclers who record the story in the Bible show that for all their gifts, Saul, David, and Solomon were essentially failures as leaders of the kind of community that Israel was meant to be. Their successors are given shorter shrift and treated with scant sympathy. When the kingdom broke in two after Solomon's death, the divided states of Israel and Judah remained separated for more than 2 centuries, until the northern half, which had retained the name of Israel, fell before the ruthless warlords of Assyria. A century and a half later, the southern half, Judah, was likewise ravaged and destroyed in its turn by the new world power of Babylon. Jerusalem was sacked, and by 587 BC, the kingdom founded by Saul had ceased to exist. The tale of the 39 monarchs who reigned over the severed halves of Israel during these 3.5 centuries is dismissed in 36 short chapters of the Bible. In the eyes of the recorders of the story, this is all they were worth. Once or twice, one or other of them comes in for a word of praise, but in the main it's a depressing tale of petty warfare, intrigue, and political manoeuvring. Israel's end as a nation was in sight. So it was that Israel had to learn to look for her leadership not in her kings, but in her prophets. From now on, the Bible spotlights a series of remarkable figures who emerge as critics of the kings and keepers of the nation's conscience. Taken together, the prophets of Israel are a unique phenomenon in the history of religion. It was they who taught Israel to see that it was not in the purpose of God that she should be a nation like the other nations, questing for power, prestige, and material progress, and that God was teaching her through the disasters that befell her where her true vocation lay. The first and greatest of the prophets had been, of course, Moses. He it was who had given Israel a new understanding of her role in the world, together with a new insight into the nature of the God who had given her this assignment, and the standard of behaviour that was expected. Lesser men who came after Moses had to some extent shared his insights. God did not ever leave himself without a witness. And through these queer and fanatical wandering prophets who appear in Israel's story after she settled in Canaan, as well as through the more striking contribution of men such as Samuel and Nathan, God was constantly reminding his people of what they stood for and ensuring that Israel should not forget her high calling. In the period of history between the end of Solomon's reign and her final, or apparently final, disappearance as a recognisable national unit, when her kings were by and large unfit to be leaders, Israel was kept in awareness of her destiny by prophets of the calibre of Elijah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. These were not by any means the only prophets, but they were the greatest of them. Each had a distinctive contribution to make, and it was due to them that when the final crash came, Israel did not perish in despair and disillusionment, but rose again to a new beginning, chastened but enlightened, convinced that God still had a mighty purpose for his people, which they were only then beginning to understand. The prophets of Israel conformed to no set pattern. They were priests or statesmen, counselors of kings or ordinary working men. Some of them behaved as oddly as the wandering holy men in the time of Saul. Some of them brought about changes in national policy. Some of them paid for their honesty with their lives. Essentially, they were men of God who, out of their deep personal commitment to God, spoke to the people of their day, to kings and commoners alike, in protest, in warning, in comfort or encouragement, as the need arose and as the situation demanded. Some of the things they said have been collected by their followers in the books that bear their name. And these prophetic books in the Old Testament, Amos, Isaiah, and the rest, provide a running commentary on the events and experiences that the prophets shared with their countrymen, but which from their own deep religious convictions they were better able to interpret than their rulers or their neighbours. What they said, they claimed to be the word of God. Thus saith the Lord, not thus said Amos or Isaiah. They were not infallible. Sometimes their forecasts of events proved to be wrong, and their limitations were as great as those of anyone else at the time. But on the issues of right and wrong, of justice and injustice, of religious insincerity and political chicanery, their judgment was sound and fearless. It was due to them that the faith and standards of Israel were moulded into the legacy which Jesus and Paul inherited, and which they in their turn passed on with their own distinctive contributions to Christianity. It is a complete misunderstanding of the prophets to think of them primarily as prognosticators of future events. Their chief function was that of spokesman of God, and what they had to say dealt with the past and the present as much as with the future. They looked at the world as they found it and saw behind the things that were happening the pattern of God's activity in human affairs and the response that man must make. As often as not, what they said was not what men wanted to hear. Often their protests fell on deaf ears. Often they were ill-treated and humiliated, attacked and vilified. They did not speak in a vacuum, but always in the situation of their day, involving themselves in the political, economic and social movements of the time, and taking part in the arguments that raged around the particular issues of the moment. They spoke out in the name of God on questions of peace and war, public and private morality, the rights of the common man and the obligations of the common man, without fear or favour, because they believed that it is the whole of life that God is concerned with, and not merely public worship or private piety.